Did medieval foolish customs cost people their lives? Imagine living in a world where an idea could become popular long before anyone had a reliable way to test whether it was safe. There were no modern laboratories waiting to examine a new medicine. No government agency carefully checking whether a treatment worked. No standardized medical textbooks sitting on every physician's shelf. And there was certainly no internet where an ordinary person could spend an evening reading thousands of warnings from people who had already tried something and discovered that it was a terrible idea. In medieval Europe, knowledge traveled slowly, unevenly, and sometimes incorrectly. A remedy could be repeated for generations, simply because people believed it had always been done that way. A medical practice could survive because a respected physician recommended it. A dangerous fashion could spread because somebody important wore it. And an old superstition could become so deeply woven into daily life that questioning it seemed more foolish than following it. This does not mean medieval people were stupid. That distinction matters. The people who lived between roughly the 5th and 15th centuries were capable of extraordinary engineering, mathematics, medicine, agriculture, architecture, navigation, and craftsmanship. They built enormous stone cathedrals without modern cranes. They developed sophisticated systems of water management. They cultivated crops in difficult environments. They preserved ancient writings, produced new scholarship, and created practical technologies that would influence later centuries. But intelligence does not protect anyone from bad information. And sometimes the most dangerous ideas are not the ideas that sound ridiculous. They are the ideas that sound reasonable. That is where our journey begins. Because some medieval practices became so familiar that people could participate in them without thinking of themselves as taking a risk at all. Consider medicine. If you became seriously ill in the medieval world, you might seek the help of a trained practitioner. Depending on where you lived and the period in question, that might mean a physician educated in learned medical traditions, a barber surgeon, an apothecary, a local healer, or someone whose reputation rested largely on experience. There were genuine medical observations behind some treatments. Medieval physicians understood that diet mattered. They knew that cleanliness could sometimes affect wounds. They recognized certain symptoms and attempted to distinguish different illnesses. They also inherited enormous bodies of medical knowledge from Greek, Roman, Arabic, Persian, and other intellectual traditions. But their understanding of the human body was limited. One of the most influential medical systems was based on the idea of 4 bodily fluids, commonly called humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile. Health was believed to depend upon a balance among these substances. Disease could therefore be interpreted as an imbalance, and once a person accepted that framework, removing blood from a patient could appear perfectly logical. This brings us to one of the most persistent medical practices of the medieval world: bloodletting. The basic idea was simple. If too much blood was thought to be causing a problem, perhaps removing some of it would restore balance. The procedure could be performed in different ways. Sometimes, a practitioner opened a vein. Sometimes, blood was removed with small cutting instruments. And sometimes, leeches were used. The important point is that bloodletting was not merely some bizarre medieval superstition. It belonged to a much older medical tradition and was used in different places and periods for a wide variety of complaints. The danger came from the confidence with which the practice could be applied. If someone had lost blood because of an injury, removing more blood was obviously not going to help. If someone was already weak, repeated bloodletting could make the situation worse. And if the procedure was performed improperly, there were additional risks. Yet the practice could continue because medical reasoning at the time had its own internal logic. That is something worth remembering throughout this entire story. People rarely wake up one morning and decide to adopt a completely senseless practice. Usually, there is a chain of reasoning. The reasoning may begin with a mistaken assumption. Then somebody influential accepts it. Then other people repeat it. Eventually, the original assumption becomes so familiar that nobody notices it anymore. And once an idea becomes traditional, tradition itself can start looking like evidence. The medieval world was full of this problem. Another example was the use of substances believed to possess medicinal properties simply because their supposed qualities fit an existing theory. Plants, minerals, animal products, metals, and mixtures of numerous ingredients could all appear in medical recipes. Some ingredients genuinely contained useful compounds. Others probably did very little. Some could be harmful, and the exact dose could matter enormously. A substance might be helpful in one amount and dangerous in another. Without modern chemical analysis, determining that boundary was difficult. Even more difficult was proving whether the treatment itself had caused improvement. If a sick person recovered after taking a particular mixture, the mixture might receive the credit. If the patient died, the disease might receive the blame. This creates a problem that existed long before modern clinical trials. People are naturally inclined to notice successful outcomes and remember them. Failures are often explained away, and that can allow ineffective or dangerous treatments to survive. One of the most fascinating examples comes from the medieval use of astrology in medicine. To modern eyes, the idea that the position of planets could influence medical decisions may seem extraordinary. But medieval astrology was not necessarily treated as entertainment. For some learned practitioners, celestial movements were part of a larger intellectual system used to understand the natural world. The heavens were believed to have relationships with earthly events. Therefore, the timing of medical procedures could sometimes be connected with astrological considerations. There were even traditions involving the zodiac and different parts of the human body. A physician might consult an astrological calendar before recommending a procedure. The danger here was not always that the stars directly caused a person to die. The more subtle danger was misplaced confidence. If someone believed that a particular day or celestial configuration was ideal for a procedure, that belief could influence when treatment was given. And if the underlying medical condition required immediate attention, delaying action could become dangerous. Still, we should resist the temptation to imagine every medieval physician staring dramatically at the sky before touching a patient. Medieval medical practice varied enormously by location, century, social class, and individual practitioner. Some physicians were skeptical of particular astrological claims. Others regarded astrology as important. The medieval medical world was not a single system. It was a mixture of inherited theories, local practices, religious beliefs, practical experience, and developing scholarship. That mixture could produce both useful observations and terrible mistakes. And sometimes, the most dangerous mistake was the belief that suffering itself had to be endured. Pain was not always interpreted in the same way we interpret it today. People certainly wanted relief from pain. They knew what pain was. They feared it. They attempted to treat it. But their options were limited. Opium-containing preparations, alcohol, herbal medicines, and other substances were known in various traditions, although their availability and use differed considerably. There were also surgical procedures performed without anything resembling modern anesthesia. Imagine the implications. A surgeon might need to remove damaged tissue, treat a wound, drain an abscess, or perform another invasive procedure. The patient was conscious. The tools were basic by modern standards. Pain control was limited, and infection was a constant danger. Yet surgeons still performed difficult operations. Some patients survived, some did not. It would be unfair to call medieval surgery simply barbaric. In some circumstances, practical surgical knowledge was remarkably sophisticated. Surgeons understood things through direct experience that theoretical physicians might understand differently. They knew how to handle certain wounds. They learned techniques for stopping bleeding. They developed specialized instruments. They performed amputations. They treated fractures and dislocations. But surgery existed in an environment where microorganisms were unknown. A wound could become infected without anyone understanding why. A surgeon could wash an instrument for practical reasons without knowing anything about bacteria. A patient could develop a fever days later, and the cause might be mysterious. This brings us to another practice that could turn a medical attempt into a disaster. Wound treatment with substances that seemed reasonable, but were not necessarily sterile. Medieval medical texts contain numerous recipes for treating wounds. Some involved herbs or other substances that may have had useful properties. Others were more questionable. The problem was that the people preparing these remedies had no concept of germ theory. They could not see microscopic organisms. They could not culture bacteria. They could not distinguish sterile material from contaminated material in the modern sense. A treatment could look clean and still carry invisible dangers. And sometimes the treatment itself could introduce contamination. This is one reason why the medieval world could be so dangerous for anyone suffering a serious injury. A simple cut could remain simple, or it could become something much worse. There was another problem. Medieval people lived in environments where minor injuries were common: agricultural work, animal handling, construction, metalworking, cooking, travel, military activity. Even ordinary household tasks could produce cuts and burns. Most injuries were probably not fatal, but the possibility of infection meant that people lived with a risk that is easy for us to underestimate. Today, a person can receive antibiotics for many bacterial infections. Medieval people had no such safety net. If an infection progressed, the body had to fight it without modern antimicrobial medicine, and sometimes it lost. Yet medical mistakes were only one part of the story. Some of the most dangerous medieval beliefs involved something far more ordinary. Food. People needed to eat every day, and they had to make decisions about food without modern refrigeration, food testing, standardized packaging, or detailed knowledge of microbiology. This does not mean medieval people were constantly poisoning themselves. They developed many practical methods for preserving food: salting, drying, smoking, fermenting, pickling. These methods could be remarkably effective, but preservation was never perfect. Food could spoil. Water could become contaminated. Storage conditions could encourage pests, and people sometimes had to eat whatever was available because wasting food could itself be dangerous. Imagine a household in which winter stores represent months of work. Grain has been harvested. Meat has been preserved. Vegetables have been dried or stored. Nothing can simply be replaced by a quick trip to a supermarket. If something begins to deteriorate, the decision is not necessarily as simple as throwing it away. For a poor household, wasting food could mean going hungry later, so people developed judgments about what could still be eaten. Sometimes those judgments were correct. Sometimes they were not. And one of the most dangerous enemies was not always visible: mold. Certain molds can produce toxins. People in the medieval period could obviously see mold growing on food, but they did not understand the microscopic chemistry involved. A suspicious piece of food might be scraped, cut, dried, cooked, or mixed with something else. Whether that made it safe depended entirely on the contaminant and circumstances. But the underlying idea was understandable. If the bad-looking portion was removed, perhaps the rest was fine. Sometimes it may have been. Sometimes it was not. And food danger became even more complicated when grains were involved. Cereal crops were central to medieval diets. Wheat, rye, barley, oats, and other grains supported entire communities. But crops could suffer from disease and contamination. One particularly important example is ergot, a fungus that can infect rye and other grasses. Ergot contamination can cause serious poisoning. Historically, outbreaks of ergotism produced terrifying symptoms, including severe pain, convulsions, hallucinations, and circulatory problems. The people experiencing these symptoms did not know they were dealing with fungal toxins. They had no microscope to reveal the cause. They could only interpret what they saw. And when a community experienced strange illness, people could reach explanations that had little connection to the real cause. This is one reason medieval history can sometimes feel mysterious. A village could experience a cluster of bizarre symptoms. People might search for an explanation. Perhaps someone had been cursed. Perhaps evil forces were involved. Perhaps the illness had a supernatural cause. Perhaps someone had violated a religious rule. But occasionally, the explanation was sitting inside a sack of grain. The same problem existed with water. Today, we often treat clean drinking water as something so ordinary that we forget how revolutionary modern water treatment is. Medieval communities obtained water from wells, springs, rivers, cisterns, and other sources. Some sources were relatively safe. Others were vulnerable to contamination. Urban environments could be particularly difficult. Human waste, animal waste, household refuse, industrial activities, and runoff could all affect water quality. People did understand that some water sources were better than others. They did not need microbiology to notice that certain wells smelled bad or that certain streams were unpleasant. They could also recognize that drinking some water made people sick. But they could not identify pathogens in the modern sense. As a result, avoiding contaminated water depended heavily on observation and local knowledge. And local knowledge could fail. Sometimes the most dangerous medieval trend was not a particular fashion or treatment. It was the tendency to trust an authority simply because that authority was respected. This brings us to one of the strangest ideas of the medieval world: trial by ordeal. The concept varied considerably across time and place, and it is important not to imagine every medieval court using the same method. But certain forms of ordeal involved the accused undergoing a dangerous physical test, with the result interpreted as evidence of guilt or innocence. One famous type involved heated metal, another involved water. The underlying logic was connected to divine judgment. If ordinary human beings could not determine the truth, perhaps God would reveal it. That may sound bizarre to modern ears, but within a society deeply shaped by religious belief, the concept had a particular internal logic. The problem was obvious from a modern perspective. The test itself could injure people. And interpreting the outcome as supernatural proof could lead to disastrous consequences. A person might suffer burns. A person might drown. A person might be judged guilty based on an injury that had nothing to do with actual guilt. Yet it is important to understand that ordeals were not simply random medieval entertainment. They existed within legal and religious systems that were much more complex than the stereotype suggests, and their use changed over time. In parts of medieval Europe, church authorities eventually moved away from certain forms of ordeal. Legal systems increasingly developed other methods of determining guilt. Evidence, testimony, written records, and judicial procedures became more important in many contexts. The decline of ordeal itself shows something important. Medieval societies were not frozen. Ideas changed. Institutions changed. People argued. Practices were abandoned. New practices appeared. And sometimes, a terrible idea could remain popular for centuries before finally losing its authority. This pattern appears again and again. A practice begins. People find reasons to justify it. The practice becomes familiar. Familiarity becomes tradition. Tradition becomes authority. And authority makes questioning difficult. There is perhaps no better example than certain medieval beauty practices. Beauty has always carried risks. People alter their hair, their clothing, their skin, their teeth, their posture, their appearance. The medieval world was no exception. People cared about appearance, status, cleanliness, fashion, and attractiveness. But beauty standards could sometimes encourage unhealthy behavior. The exact practices varied enormously across centuries and regions, so it would be misleading to describe one universal medieval beauty routine. Yet there were preparations involving cosmetics and pigments that could contain substances we now recognize as hazardous. Lead compounds, for example, were known and used in various historical contexts. The danger was not always understood. A substance could be valued for its color, texture, or perceived cosmetic effect without anyone knowing that repeated exposure could cause poisoning. This is a recurring theme in human history. A material can be useful and dangerous at the same time. The medieval person did not have access to modern toxicology. They could not look at a cosmetic powder and know its chemical composition. They judged it by what they could see. If it made the skin appear desirable, that visible result could outweigh invisible risks. And invisible risks are among the hardest dangers for human beings to fear. We are naturally better at recognizing a sword than a toxin. A collapsing roof is obvious. A contaminated substance is not. Fire is visible. Carbon monoxide is not. A poisonous chemical can look exactly like something harmless. The medieval world contained many invisible dangers. Smoke, contamination, toxins, infection, and disease. But perhaps one of the most fascinating, dangerous trends involved the way people understood the supernatural. Medieval Europe was deeply religious, but religious belief was not identical everywhere. People could hold complicated combinations of Christian beliefs, local traditions, inherited customs, folk practices, and ideas about magic. Some practices were considered acceptable, others were condemned. And the boundary could vary depending on place and period. People sought protection from illness, bad luck, storms, childbirth complications, and other dangers. They used prayers, relics, amulets, blessings, charms. Certain objects were believed to provide protection. The use of protective objects itself did not necessarily kill anyone. The danger arose when a supernatural explanation replaced a necessary practical response. If someone believed a protective charm was enough, they might delay seeking other assistance. If illness was interpreted only as a spiritual problem, physical causes could be overlooked. But again, we should be careful. Medieval religious people did not necessarily reject practical medicine. Many physicians were themselves religious. Monasteries preserved and practiced medical knowledge. Prayer and medicine could coexist. The medieval mind was not divided into two neat categories called science and superstition. People often combined multiple explanations. A person could pray for healing and still seek a physician. They could use an herbal remedy and ask for a blessing. They could believe that God controlled the world, while also believing that natural causes existed. The world was complicated, and that complexity makes the truly dangerous trends more interesting. Because the issue was rarely simply that people were foolish. They were working with the information available to them. And information can be wrong, even when the person using it is intelligent. Think about a farmer. A farmer might understand the soil better than a university scholar. A blacksmith might understand metal better than a physician. A midwife might possess generations of practical knowledge about childbirth that was not recorded in formal medical books. A sailor might understand weather signs through experience. A surgeon might know exactly how to treat a particular wound because he had seen similar injuries many times. Medieval knowledge was distributed across society. The problem was that some useful knowledge existed alongside harmful beliefs. Sometimes the two were impossible to separate, and sometimes a dangerous practice survived precisely because it seemed to work. This brings us back to medicine. Imagine someone with a headache. A particular treatment is given. The headache disappears. The person concludes that the treatment worked, but perhaps the headache would have disappeared naturally. Maybe the person slept. Maybe they drank water. Maybe the illness simply ran its course. Without controlled experiments, it is extremely difficult to know. Now imagine that this happens not once, but 100 times. The treatment becomes trusted. A book records it. A respected practitioner recommends it. Students learn it. Generations repeat it. Soon, the treatment is no longer merely an experiment. It is tradition, and tradition can be remarkably stubborn. Some medieval medical texts contained elaborate recipes with long lists of ingredients. To a modern reader, the complexity itself might look impressive, but complexity does not guarantee effectiveness. A mixture of 10 ingredients is not automatically better than a mixture of 2, and some substances could interact in harmful ways. Without modern pharmacology, practitioners could not reliably predict those interactions. They had to rely on inherited knowledge, observation, and theory. Sometimes that worked. Sometimes it did not. There is another important danger here: dosage. Even a useful substance can become harmful when too much is taken. Medieval practitioners certainly understood that some substances were potent. They had practical experience with medicines. But standardized measurement was far less precise than modern pharmaceutical dosing. Weights and measures varied. Ingredients varied in strength. Preparation methods varied. Storage conditions varied. The same recipe might therefore produce different results. A medicine prepared by one practitioner might not be identical to the same medicine prepared elsewhere. And when something went wrong, determining why could be extremely difficult. This is why the phrase, "medieval people did everything dangerously," is misleading. They did not. They were often highly practical. They developed ways to make dangerous activities safer. They learned from experience. But their safety systems were built on incomplete information. That distinction is important. A medieval carpenter knew that a badly supported structure could collapse. A mason knew that stone could fall. A farmer knew that animals could injure people. A sailor knew that storms could destroy ships. A soldier knew that weapons were dangerous. These were visible risks. Invisible risks were different. Disease, contamination, toxic exposure, some forms of environmental danger, and certain medical errors. The human brain has always struggled with dangers that cannot be seen, and medieval people were no different. One particularly revealing example is the medieval approach to bad smells. Before germ theory, unpleasant odors were often associated with disease in various medical traditions. The idea was not entirely irrational. Bad-smelling environments really could be unhealthy. Rotting organic matter can indicate contamination. Poor sanitation often produces unpleasant odors. But the relationship between smell and disease was misunderstood. People could believe that foul air itself carried illness. This became associated with ideas about poisonous or corrupted air. Such beliefs influenced responses to epidemics. People might attempt to avoid bad smells. They might burn aromatic substances. They might use perfumes or smoke. These actions could make an environment smell better. But pleasant-smelling air was not necessarily safe air. A disease-causing organism does not need to announce itself with an unpleasant odor. A room can smell beautiful and still contain dangerous pathogens. This is another lesson that would take humanity centuries to fully appreciate. The senses are useful, but the senses are not perfect scientific instruments. Something can smell good and be dangerous. Something can smell bad and be harmless. Something can look clean and be contaminated. Something can look dirty and be relatively safe. Without microscopes and modern laboratory science, medieval people had to rely heavily on what their senses could detect, and that created enormous blind spots. Now imagine how this affected epidemics. When disease spread through a town, people searched desperately for explanations. They noticed patterns. They watched who became sick. They noticed where people lived. They observed what people ate. They saw strange coincidences. But without knowledge of microorganisms and modern epidemiology, connecting all those observations correctly was extraordinarily difficult. Sometimes they identified useful patterns. Sometimes they blamed the wrong things. And during moments of fear, communities could become particularly vulnerable to harmful explanations. Fear changes behavior. A person who normally thinks carefully may suddenly accept a frightening rumor. A community that normally trusts its neighbors may become suspicious. A medical explanation can be replaced by a moral explanation. A natural disaster can become a supernatural warning. An unfamiliar illness can become evidence of hidden enemies. This is not uniquely medieval. It is a human tendency. But in a world without modern communication and scientific institutions, rumors could have enormous consequences. And that is why some of the most dangerous medieval trends were not physical objects at all. They were ideas. Ideas about who was responsible. Ideas about what caused disease. Ideas about what treatments worked. Ideas about what God wanted. Ideas about what society should fear. Once an idea became widespread, it could influence decisions that affected thousands of lives. The strange thing is that many of these ideas did not appear dangerous at first. They could begin as attempts to explain the unknown. And humans hate unexplained events. When something frightening happens, the mind wants a cause. It wants a story. It wants order. If a crop fails, there must be a reason. If a child becomes ill, there must be a reason. If a storm destroys a village, there must be a reason. If several people die suddenly, there must be a reason. And when reliable evidence is unavailable, people build explanations from whatever knowledge they possess. Sometimes those explanations are helpful. Sometimes they are catastrophically wrong. This is perhaps the central lesson of our journey through medieval history. The most dangerous trend was not always the strangest one. It was the habit of turning uncertainty into certainty. A physician could be uncertain about a disease, but still feel pressured to provide an explanation. A judge could be uncertain about guilt, but still have to make a decision. A parent could be uncertain about a child's illness, but still need to act. A community could be uncertain about an epidemic, but still need someone to blame. And certainty feels comforting, even when it is wrong. So as we continue through the medieval world, we will encounter more practices that seem astonishing from a modern perspective. Some involved medicine, some involved food, some involved beauty, some involved law, some involved warfare. Some involved religion and superstition, and some were simply fashionable ideas that people accepted because everyone around them accepted them. But we should not laugh too quickly, because the uncomfortable truth is that every age has its own version of a dangerous trend. People in the future may look at some of our habits with the same disbelief that we feel when reading about medieval practices. They may wonder how intelligent people could have accepted certain ideas for so long. They may find our confidence almost as strange as we find the confidence of the medieval world. And perhaps that is why this story matters. The medieval world was not populated by foolish people. It was populated by ordinary human beings trying to understand an extraordinarily difficult world. They made brilliant discoveries. They made terrible mistakes. They trusted experience. They trusted tradition. They trusted authority. They trusted their senses. And sometimes they trusted things that had never truly been tested. As the centuries passed, some of those beliefs slowly weakened. Others disappeared. Some transformed into new ideas, and some survived far longer than anyone might expect. The story of these dangerous trends is therefore not simply a story about people who did foolish things. It is a story about how human beings decide what is true. And once we understand that, the medieval world becomes much more interesting. Because behind every strange practice was a person. Someone who was afraid. Someone who was hopeful. Someone who wanted to live. Someone who wanted to protect a child. Someone who wanted to cure a disease. Someone who wanted to look beautiful. Someone who wanted justice. Someone who simply wanted to survive another winter. And sometimes, tragically, the thing they trusted to save them was exactly what made their situation worse. The night is quiet now. The medieval streets have long disappeared beneath later buildings. The old workshops have fallen silent. The physicians who once prepared their medicines are gone. The people who believed in those remedies are gone. But their questions remain. What do we do when we do not know? Whom do we trust? How do we decide whether something works? And how long should a tradition survive before someone has the courage to ask whether it was ever right in the first place? Those questions will follow us as we move deeper into the medieval world, because the next mistakes were not merely strange. Some were deadly precisely because they looked sensible. And that is where our journey continues. Because some of the most dangerous medieval practices were not obviously foolish at all. They were practical. They were familiar. They were sometimes recommended by respected people. And because they appeared to make sense, they could become deeply rooted in everyday life. One of the clearest examples was the medieval obsession with balancing the body. The human body was often understood through a system of qualities: hot, cold, dry, moist. These qualities were connected with the four humors, and medical practitioners used this framework to explain health and illness. Food itself could also be classified according to these qualities. A certain food might be considered warming, another cooling, another drying, another moistening. If someone became ill, the goal was often to restore balance. The idea sounds strange now, but there was a practical observation hiding inside it. Food really does affect the body. Some foods are easier to digest than others. Some influence hydration. Some affect body temperature indirectly. Some contain substances that influence digestion or other bodily processes. The problem was that medieval medical theory connected these real observations to a much larger system that did not accurately describe human physiology. And once the theory was accepted, almost anything could be interpreted through it. A person might be told to avoid one food and eat another because the physician believed their internal qualities were unbalanced. Sometimes the advice was harmless. Sometimes it might even have been useful. But occasionally, restrictive diets could weaken someone who was already sick. This became especially concerning when illness lasted a long time. A person who was already losing weight might be encouraged to follow dietary restrictions based on medical theory rather than nutritional needs. And because nutrition science did not exist in its modern form, there was no understanding of calories, vitamins, essential amino acids, or many other things we now consider fundamental. People knew that food gave strength. They knew that certain foods were filling. They knew that hunger weakened the body, but they did not understand the biochemical reasons. This created another invisible danger: deficiency. A person could eat enough food to avoid immediate starvation and still fail to receive certain nutrients. Some deficiency diseases became common in populations whose diets were heavily dependent on a limited range of foods. Yet people did not necessarily recognize the underlying nutritional cause. Instead, symptoms could be interpreted through other medical theories. Weakness might be blamed on an imbalance. Fatigue might be blamed on illness. Swelling might be interpreted according to humoral ideas. And the real problem could remain hidden. The same difficulty appeared in childbirth. Medieval childbirth was dangerous for reasons that had little to do with stupidity. Pregnancy itself carries risks. Labor can become complicated. Bleeding can be fatal. Infection can become deadly. A baby can become trapped in the birth canal, and without modern surgery, blood transfusion, antibiotics, or reliable obstetric monitoring, there were situations in which very little could be done. Yet medieval women were not passive. Midwives possessed practical knowledge accumulated through generations. They understood positions of the fetus. They recognized stages of labor. They knew many traditional methods for assisting difficult births. They also knew when a situation was becoming dangerous. But their knowledge existed alongside beliefs and practices that could sometimes make childbirth more difficult. Pregnancy was surrounded by advice about foods, activities, emotions, supernatural influences, and bodily behavior. Some recommendations were sensible. Others were based on tradition rather than evidence. And when childbirth went badly, the explanation could be complex. A difficult birth might be blamed on divine punishment. It might be viewed as a natural complication. It might be connected to the mother's behavior. It might be interpreted through astrology or other beliefs. The danger of blaming the mother is easy to understand. If a complication is caused by something beyond human control, there may be little anyone can do. But if people believe the mother caused it through some mistake, the result can be guilt instead of understanding. And guilt does not stop bleeding. Guilt does not reposition a baby. Guilt does not cure infection. This distinction is important. Many medieval people genuinely tried to help. The problem was that the tools available to them were limited. Now consider another familiar medieval belief: the importance of blood. Blood was not merely a biological fluid. It carried enormous symbolic and medical significance. People understood that losing blood could be dangerous. A wounded person who bled heavily could become weak or die. That much was obvious. But the medical interpretation of blood went much further. Blood was connected to temperament, health, and bodily balance. This helped sustain practices such as bloodletting. But it also influenced broader ideas about health. A person who appeared flushed might be thought to have an excess of blood. Someone pale might be interpreted differently. Physical appearance became part of diagnosis. Again, observation itself was not foolish. Doctors today still observe skin color, breathing, posture, and other visible signs. The mistake came when visible signs were interpreted through an inaccurate biological model. And this is something that happens in every era. We see something. We create an explanation. Then we start treating the explanation as fact. Once that happens, evidence that supports the explanation becomes memorable. Evidence against it becomes inconvenient. The medieval medical world was not immune to this human weakness. Neither was medieval society as a whole. Consider clothing. Clothing was not simply about fashion. It could determine social status. It could identify occupation. It could communicate wealth. In some societies, laws attempted to regulate what different social groups were permitted to wear. These were sometimes called sumptuary laws. Their details varied greatly by place and period. The basic concern was often social order. Authorities worried that people might dress above their station. Merchants might imitate nobles. Wealthy urban families might display excessive luxury. Clothing could therefore become a political issue. And although breaking a dress rule did not necessarily get someone killed, the social pressures surrounding appearance could become intense. Clothing could also become physically dangerous. Certain fabrics and dyes required complicated processes. Some pigments and chemicals used historically could be hazardous. And elaborate clothing could restrict movement. Heavy garments could create difficulties for people working outdoors. Long sleeves, trailing fabric, or complicated footwear could become inconvenient around fire, machinery, animals, or crowded streets. Yet people continued to wear such clothing because clothing had purposes beyond comfort. It communicated identity. It displayed wealth. It protected against weather. It preserved modesty. It followed custom. And sometimes looking respectable was considered worth tolerating considerable discomfort. This brings us to hairstyles. Hair was deeply connected to identity and social expectations. Men and women in different medieval cultures wore a wide variety of styles. Some hairstyles were practical, others were elaborate. Certain forms of headwear could become complicated. But the danger was not necessarily the hairstyle itself. It was the materials and techniques sometimes used to maintain it. Cosmetics, dyes, oils, powders, and other substances could contain ingredients that were not harmless. People did not know about modern toxicology. If a substance produced a desirable visual effect, that could be enough to establish its reputation. And reputation spreads. One person uses something, another sees the result. A third copies it. A merchant begins selling it. A recipe gets written down. Soon the substance is no longer an experiment. It is part of fashion. This pattern is remarkably modern. The medieval difference was that there were fewer reliable ways to determine what was actually safe. There was no modern regulatory system capable of testing every cosmetic product. There were no standardized ingredient labels. There were no laboratory toxicology reports available to ordinary consumers. If a product had a good reputation, that reputation could be more influential than any scientific evidence. And reputation could survive even when people were harmed. Now, let us move away from appearance and into one of the most dangerous environments of medieval life: the kitchen. Fire was everywhere. Cooking required open flames. Heating required fire. Lighting could involve flame. Candles were common. Oil lamps were used in some places. A medieval household was therefore surrounded by a hazard that modern homes have largely separated from daily life. Fire could spread quickly. Buildings were often constructed from combustible materials. Roofs could contain thatch. Wooden structures were common. Dense urban neighborhoods could make fires particularly destructive. A cooking accident might therefore become more than a household inconvenience. It could become a disaster. People understood the danger of fire very well. Medieval communities developed rules and practices intended to reduce it. But fire prevention was limited by technology and building conditions. A person could take precautions and still lose everything. And when fire became widespread, there was no modern fire department arriving with pressurized hoses and specialized vehicles. Communities had to respond with the tools they had: buckets, water sources, human labor, sometimes demolition of nearby structures to create fire breaks. A building might be pulled down to stop flames from reaching another. Imagine how frightening that would be. You are standing in a narrow street. Smoke is filling the air. The roof of a nearby building is burning. People are carrying water. Others are moving possessions. Someone is shouting. And everyone knows that the fire can cross from one building to another. This was not a world in which fire was a distant possibility. It was a constant part of life. The same is true of candles. A candle seems harmless, but a flame placed near dry cloth, straw, wood, or paper can become dangerous very quickly. Medieval people were familiar with this risk, yet they had to live with it. There was no electricity. Darkness was a daily reality. After sunset, work and travel became more difficult. People needed light. So they accepted the risks associated with flame. This reveals something important about dangerous trends. Sometimes people knowingly accept a danger because the alternative is also difficult. The issue is not always ignorance. Sometimes it is necessity. A medieval household could not simply decide to stop using fire. A farmer could not avoid animals. A blacksmith could not avoid heat. A sailor could not avoid the sea. A surgeon could not avoid blood. A cook could not avoid flames. Life itself required risk. The trouble began when unnecessary risks were added to unavoidable ones. And medieval society sometimes did exactly that. Take warfare. War was obviously dangerous. No one needed to be convinced that swords, arrows, spears, and other weapons could kill. But medieval warfare also involved practices that increased danger for soldiers and civilians. Armor is a good example. Modern popular culture sometimes portrays medieval armor as either impossibly heavy or almost magically protective. The reality was more complicated. Well-made armor could provide substantial protection. It was designed by people who understood practical combat. But armor had limitations. It could be expensive. It could be uncomfortable. It could reduce mobility depending on its design and the conditions. And poorly maintained equipment could fail. Yet the greatest danger in medieval warfare was not usually the armor. It was the environment. Marching for long distances, exposure to cold, heat, dehydration, poor food, injuries, disease, crowded camps, contaminated water, animals, exhaustion. A medieval army could lose many people without ever fighting a major battle. Disease could move through a camp faster than an enemy army. This is one reason military campaigns were often logistical disasters. An army needed food. It needed water. It needed transport. It needed shelter. It needed weapons. It needed animals. And all of those requirements created opportunities for disease and injury. Soldiers who were already exhausted were more vulnerable. Animals could spread contamination. Poor sanitation could turn camps into dangerous environments. And when people became sick, commanders could not simply order modern medical teams to administer antibiotics. The medical knowledge of the period could help in some circumstances, but it could not eliminate the basic dangers of crowded human populations. Now imagine a medieval army moving through winter. Cold itself is dangerous. Wet clothing becomes dangerous. Fatigue becomes dangerous. And when hundreds or thousands of people gather together in poor conditions, minor problems can become major ones. A soldier may develop a wound. The wound becomes infected. The infection causes fever. The soldier becomes too weak to march. The army moves on. The person is left behind. This was not always the fate of every injured soldier, but the broader reality was harsh. Medieval warfare was a contest not only between armies, but between humans and their environment. And sometimes the environment won. There was another dangerous medieval trend connected with warfare and social status. The glorification of personal bravery. Courage was highly valued. Knights and warriors were expected to demonstrate courage. Reputation mattered. Honor mattered. And sometimes the desire to appear brave could encourage reckless behavior. A person might take a risk because retreat looked shameful. A warrior might remain in a dangerous position because leaving could damage his reputation. A nobleman might lead from the front because his social role demanded visible courage. This was not simply stupidity. Military leadership required courage, but courage without judgment can become recklessness. And medieval culture sometimes celebrated heroic risk-taking. The The same pattern can be found in duels. The exact forms and legal status of dueling varied considerably, but personal honor could become powerful enough that conflicts escalated into physical violence. A disagreement that might have ended with an apology in one society could become a serious confrontation in another. Once weapons were involved, the consequences could become irreversible. A wounded person might survive, or infection could later kill them. A dispute could therefore produce consequences far beyond the original insult. Honor is invisible, but its consequences can be very physical. Another dangerous cultural idea involved hospitality. Hospitality was important in many medieval societies. Offering food and shelter to guests could be considered a moral obligation. Travelers depended on hosts. Pilgrims depended on inns, monasteries, private households, and other forms of hospitality. But hospitality also created risks. A traveler could arrive carrying an illness. A household could become exposed. An inn could become crowded. People slept near strangers. They shared eating spaces. They shared water sources. They might share utensils or bedding. Again, this does not mean medieval inns were universally filthy or deadly. Many inns provided useful and necessary services. But crowded accommodation creates health risks, even when people are trying to maintain cleanliness. The more people who share a small environment, the easier it becomes for some infections to spread. Without knowledge of pathogens, people could not design environments specifically around preventing transmission. They could only work with what they understood. And their understanding was often based on visible cleanliness and traditional practices. This leads us naturally to bathing. The popular idea that medieval Europeans never bathed is simply too simplistic. Bathing existed. Public bathhouses existed in various medieval societies. People washed themselves. They washed clothing. They cleaned hands and faces. Practices varied greatly across regions and centuries. However, attitudes toward bathing changed over time and differed between communities. In some contexts, public bathing could be associated with social concerns, morality, disease, or sexual behavior. In other contexts, bathing remained an ordinary practice. The real danger came when people began to associate certain forms of bathing with health risks without fully understanding the actual causes of disease. There were historical concerns about opening the pores or exposing the body to unhealthy air, for example. Some of these ideas could discourage particular forms of washing during disease outbreaks. Yet the relationship between bathing and disease was much more complicated than simply dirty people got sick. Cleanliness matters. But sanitation, contaminated water, food, insects, respiratory transmission, and other factors also matter. Without germ theory, separating these factors was extremely difficult. And this brings us to another medieval habit, the belief that a particular smell could protect against illness. People sometimes used fragrant substances to make environments more pleasant. Aromatic herbs and other materials had long been valued. There was nothing inherently foolish about enjoying pleasant smells. But the belief that fragrance itself could protect against disease could become misleading. A pleasant smell does not kill every pathogen. Perfume can cover an odor without removing its source. This is another example of confusing a sign with a cause. If disease was associated with foul smells, making the air smell better might seem like protection. But smell was only one part of the environment. The true cause could remain untouched. Now think about clothing again. During cold weather, medieval people needed warmth. They layered clothing. They used wool, fur, linen, and other materials depending on location, wealth, and availability. But staying warm was difficult for people with limited resources. A person could become cold simply because they did not own enough fuel. Heating a home required wood, peat, charcoal, or other fuels depending on region. Fuel was not always abundant, and heating a room created another danger. Smoke. A poorly ventilated room could accumulate smoke and other combustion products. People knew smoke was unpleasant. They could cough. Their eyes could burn. But they did not understand all the dangers of indoor air pollution. A warm room could therefore carry its own hidden risks. The same fire that protected a family from cold could also make breathing difficult. And the solution was not always obvious. Open a window and lose heat. Close the room and retain smoke. Again, people were balancing one danger against another. This pattern appears throughout medieval life. There was rarely a completely safe option. You chose between risks: eat the preserved food or go hungry, light the candle or remain in darkness, use the fire or freeze, travel the road or remain at home, seek treatment or wait, trust the physician or trust the local healer, follow tradition or try something new. The difficult part was knowing which risk was smaller. And that brings us to another dangerous medieval trend: the belief that certain animals carried symbolic meanings that could influence human decisions. Medieval bestiaries often described animals not only biologically, but morally and symbolically. A lion could represent courage. A serpent could symbolize evil. A particular bird might be associated with good or bad fortune. These traditions were part of a broader symbolic culture. But symbolic interpretation could sometimes influence behavior. If an animal was considered a bad omen, encountering it might produce fear. A person might change plans because of an omen. A journey might be delayed. A decision might be altered. Again, not every medieval person behaved this way, and beliefs varied widely. But when uncertainty is high, signs become powerful. People search for patterns. A bird flies across the road. A candle flickers. A dream feels strange. A person sneezes. A horse behaves unexpectedly. A storm arrives. Any of these events can be interpreted as meaningful. The danger begins when symbolic interpretation replaces practical judgment. A sailor cannot control a storm by avoiding a particular bird. A farmer cannot guarantee a harvest by obeying an omen. A sick person cannot cure an infection by interpreting a dream. Yet humans have always been attracted to signs because signs give uncertainty a shape, and medieval people lived with enormous uncertainty. Weather could determine survival. Harvests could fail. Diseases could spread. Wars could arrive. Children could die young. Travel could become dangerous. The future was unpredictable. So people searched for patterns wherever they could. This is one reason astrology remained attractive. The stars appeared stable. They followed predictable movements. Compared with the chaos of human life, the heavens looked orderly. If the heavens were orderly, perhaps they could provide information about what was coming. For some medieval intellectuals, astrology was therefore connected to a serious attempt to understand the natural world. But there was a crucial problem. Predicting human events from celestial positions required assumptions that were not scientifically supported. And when those assumptions influenced major decisions, mistakes could become costly. Imagine delaying an important medical procedure because the stars were considered unfavorable. Imagine choosing a date for a major event because of an astrological calculation. Imagine trusting a prediction because it came from a learned practitioner. The danger was not the stars. The danger was confidence in an unsupported conclusion. And confidence is one of the most powerful forces in history. People do not always follow the person who is correct. They often follow the person who sounds certain. This was true in medieval medicine. It was true in law. It was true in politics. It was true in religion. And it remains true today. The medieval world therefore offers a strangely familiar lesson. Bad ideas do not always survive because people are unintelligent. They survive because they are repeated. They are taught. They are connected to respected institutions. They fit existing beliefs. They produce occasional successes. And most importantly, they become normal. Once something becomes normal, people stop asking whether it makes sense. That is when a trend can become dangerous. And there were trends in medieval life that could turn ordinary behavior into extraordinary risk. One of the most important was the treatment of animals. Animals were essential to medieval society. Horses transported people. Oxen pulled plows, cattle provided milk and meat, sheep provided wool, pigs provided food. Dogs guarded homes and livestock. Cats helped control rodents. Working animals were valuable. But close contact with animals also created risks. Bites could become infected. Animal diseases could spread. Large animals could crush people. Horses could kick, cattle could charge, dogs could bite. And there was no modern vaccination system for many animal-borne diseases. Rabies was particularly terrifying. People knew that certain animal bites could produce horrifying illness, although they did not understand the virus responsible. A bite from a suspicious animal could therefore become a deadly event. But medieval people did not have modern post-exposure treatment. Once symptoms developed, the disease was generally fatal. This was one of the dangers that did not require superstition. It required only biology. And biology does not care whether a society understands it. A virus does not wait until humans discover microscopes. A bacterium does not stop infecting people because nobody has named it. A toxin does not become less dangerous because the person consuming it believes it is medicine. That is the uncomfortable reality behind many medieval deaths. The world was full of biological processes that humans could not yet see. And people had to live inside that invisible world. As we continue deeper into the story, we will encounter even more examples. Some will involve strange medical remedies. Some will involve dangerous household practices. Some will involve beliefs about disease. others will involve the social pressure to behave in ways that could place lives at risk. But one thing will remain constant. The people making these choices were not monsters. They were not idiots. They were people trying to solve problems with the knowledge available to them. And sometimes their solutions worked. Sometimes they did nothing. And sometimes, tragically, the cure was more dangerous than the disease. That is where we will continue next, because the medieval world had another category of dangerous trend that could be even more powerful than medicine or superstition. Fashion, status, and the desperate human desire to look important. And when appearance became a measure of social worth, people could be willing to endure almost anything to achieve it. Sometimes that meant pain. Sometimes it meant poisoning. And sometimes it meant risking their lives simply to look like the people they admired. The story continues from there, and sometimes it meant risking their lives simply to look like the people they admired. The story continues from there, because fashion has always been more powerful than it first appears. Clothing can be practical. It can protect the body from cold, rain, wind, and sunlight. It can make work easier. It can identify a person's occupation. It can communicate wealth. And it can tell everyone around you where you believe you belong. In the medieval world, that final purpose could be extremely important. Society was deeply conscious of rank. A noble household looked different from a peasant household. A wealthy merchant might dress differently from a laborer. A religious official could be identified by clothing. A soldier could be recognized by equipment. And in many places, clothing became part of the language of status. This created an interesting problem. If clothing communicated social rank, then people could attempt to change how others perceived them simply by changing what they wore. And wealthy elites did not always appreciate that. In various medieval societies, authorities introduced rules intended to regulate luxury and appearance. These rules could restrict certain fabrics, colors, ornaments, or styles for particular social groups. The exact regulations differed enormously, but the underlying anxiety was remarkably consistent. What if people began looking richer than they really were? It sounds harmless. But medieval societies often treated social hierarchy as something that needed to be visible. If everyone could dress like a noble, how would people know who belonged to which class? Clothing therefore became political. And once clothing becomes political, fashion stops being merely fashion. It becomes a system of social control. But there was another side to this. People wanted to look fashionable. They wanted to look wealthy. They wanted to look respectable. They wanted to imitate people they admired. And sometimes they accepted considerable discomfort to achieve that appearance. Shoes are an excellent example. Medieval footwear varied widely according to period, location, class, and purpose. Many shoes were practical, but some fashionable styles could become highly elaborate. Pointed shoes became particularly associated with certain medieval fashions. The most exaggerated forms were not practical for walking long distances. Yet fashion does not always reward practicality. A shoe can be uncomfortable and still become desirable. A garment can be difficult to move in and still become fashionable. A hairstyle can require hours of preparation and still become a symbol of beauty. This is not uniquely medieval. Every generation has its uncomfortable fashions. The difference is that medieval people had fewer options for treating the consequences. A painful shoe could damage the foot. A restrictive garment could make physical work harder. A complicated outfit could become hazardous around fire or animals. But social pressure can be remarkably persuasive. If everyone around you considers a particular appearance beautiful, rejecting it can feel like rejecting society itself. And beauty was not merely personal. It could influence marriage prospects, social relationships, employment, status, access to powerful people. For someone hoping to improve their position, appearance could matter. So the risks could seem worthwhile. This becomes even more interesting when we consider cosmetics. Medieval people used a variety of substances to alter or improve appearance. The exact practices varied considerably. Some ingredients were harmless, others were not. Historical cosmetics could include mineral pigments and compounds containing metals. Some of these substances could be toxic when repeatedly applied or accidentally ingested. The people using them did not possess modern knowledge of chronic poisoning. They could not look at a powder and understand what repeated exposure might do to the nervous system, kidneys, or other organs. Instead, they judged the cosmetic by its visible effect. If it made the skin look smoother or brighter, it seemed successful, and success created demand. This is one of the oldest patterns in consumer culture. Visible benefits can hide invisible costs. A substance makes you look better today. The harm may appear months or years later. That delay makes the connection difficult to recognize. If a person becomes sick long after using a cosmetic, they may never suspect the cosmetic. The same problem occurs with many forms of environmental exposure. A single exposure may produce no obvious symptoms. Repeated exposure can slowly cause damage. Without toxicology, the pattern can remain invisible. But cosmetics were not the only substances that could cause problems. Dyes and pigments could also contain dangerous compounds. Color was enormously important in medieval culture. Certain colors were expensive because their pigments were difficult to produce. Others were easier to obtain. Color could communicate wealth. A rich, vivid fabric could make a powerful impression. So people developed complex techniques to produce desirable shades. Some materials were relatively safe. Others required substances that could irritate the skin or cause other harm. Workers involved in producing dyes and pigments could face greater exposure than consumers. This is another forgotten part of medieval life. When we admire historical clothing today, we see the finished product. We do not always think about the people who produced the color, the dyer, the fuller, the tanner, the metal worker, the miner, the person handling the chemicals, the person breathing the fumes, the person washing the fabric, the person working in the workshop for years. Occupational hazards existed long before anyone had written regulations about workplace safety. A medieval craft could be skilled, respected, and dangerous at the same time. Consider tanning. Leather was essential. Shoes, belts, gloves, harnesses, book covers, armor components, containers. Many everyday objects depended on leather. But tanning hides involved unpleasant and potentially hazardous substances and processes. Workers handled animal skins. They dealt with waste. They worked around strong odors. They used various chemical materials. And the working environment could be physically demanding. A modern industrial worker might have protective equipment, ventilation standards, and regulations. A medieval craftsperson had experience and tradition. That experience mattered. But it could not eliminate every hazard. The same was true of metalworking. Blacksmiths worked with intense heat. They struck hot metal repeatedly. They inhaled smoke and particles. They handled sharp objects. They risked burns. They risked eye injuries. They worked around fire. Yet blacksmithing was an essential profession. The danger was accepted because the work was necessary. This distinction between necessary and unnecessary risk becomes increasingly important. Medieval people were not simply careless. They were living in a world where survival required physical labor. Modern life has removed many of these dangers from ordinary experience. A person can buy food without farming it, wear clothing without making it, use metal tools without forging them, travel without caring for the animal that transports them, heat a home without chopping wood, light a room without an open flame. The medieval person often had to participate directly in the processes that produced everyday necessities. That meant exposure. And exposure meant risk. But sometimes people added risks for reasons that were not necessary. One such example was extreme fasting. Fasting has existed in many religious traditions for centuries. And it is important not to describe fasting itself as a foolish medieval trend. Religious fasting could have spiritual, social, and cultural significance. People fasted for religious reasons in many parts of the medieval world. The danger arose when extreme fasting became associated with extraordinary claims about holiness or spiritual achievement. Some individuals pursued unusually severe forms of self-denial. They might restrict food dramatically. They might endure prolonged physical discomfort. They might attempt to demonstrate devotion through suffering. For some people, these practices became admired. A person who endured enormous hardship could acquire a reputation for holiness. That reputation could attract followers. And once suffering becomes evidence of spiritual seriousness, there is a risk that greater suffering will be interpreted as greater virtue. The human body, however, has limits. Severe nutritional deprivation can weaken the immune system. It can impair judgment. It can cause fainting. It can damage organs. And in extreme circumstances, it can be fatal. The medieval religious world was not uniformly obsessed with self-starvation. Most religious people did not pursue extreme practices. But the existence of highly ascetic traditions shows how cultural values can change the meaning of physical suffering. A modern person might see prolonged starvation as an emergency. A medieval observer might interpret a particular form of voluntary deprivation as spiritual discipline. The interpretation mattered, because interpretation determines whether people intervene. If suffering is considered a sign of holiness, stopping the suffering may seem inappropriate. This is a powerful example of how cultural ideas can transform danger into virtue. And similar patterns existed outside religion. Military courage could transform recklessness into heroism. Fashion could transform pain into beauty. Social hierarchy could transform discomfort into status. Tradition could transform uncertainty into certainty. And medicine could transform blood loss into treatment. The underlying mechanism was the same. A dangerous behavior becomes safer in people's minds once it receives a positive meaning. This is why trends can be so powerful. They do not merely tell people what to do. They tell people what the behavior means. A dangerous action can become brave. A painful action can become beautiful. A restrictive action can become holy. A questionable treatment can become respectable. And once the meaning changes, the risk becomes easier to ignore. This happened in another area of medieval life. Pilgrimage. Pilgrimage was an important part of religious life for many medieval Christians and Muslims, among others, although the traditions and destinations varied greatly. Travel could be spiritually meaningful. It could involve visiting sacred places. It could be an act of devotion. It could fulfill a vow. It could bring a sense of identity and community. But medieval travel was difficult. Roads could be poor. Weather could be unpredictable. Food could be uncertain. Disease could spread. Bandits could threaten travelers in some regions and periods. Rivers had to be crossed. Mountains had to be navigated. And long-distance travel could exhaust the body. Yet pilgrims continued. Why? Because the purpose of the journey could be considered more important than the danger. This does not make pilgrimage foolish. It makes it meaningful. But meaning can encourage risk. A person may accept conditions they would never tolerate under ordinary circumstances because they believe the destination is worth it. That is another universal human behavior. People climb mountains, cross oceans, enter deserts, travel through war zones, undertake dangerous expeditions. The medieval pilgrim was not fundamentally different. The difference was the technology available. A modern traveler can use weather forecasts, maps, GPS, air conditioning, emergency communication, hotels, hospitals, reliable transport. A medieval traveler had far fewer protections, and yet they still traveled, sometimes enormous distances. Another danger was exhaustion. The human body requires sleep. Medieval people understood the need for rest, even if their sleeping patterns varied by social context and period. But travelers, soldiers, laborers, and messengers could be forced to remain awake for long periods. Fatigue reduces attention. It increases the chance of accidents. A tired person handling animals, crossing difficult terrain, or traveling at night becomes more vulnerable. Night travel itself could be dangerous. Roads were not illuminated like modern streets. A person walking after sunset had limited visibility. A small obstacle could become a serious hazard. A fall could cause injury. A river crossing could become deadly. And darkness also reduced the ability to recognize threats. Still, people traveled at night when necessary. Again, necessity changed the calculation. The medieval world constantly required people to make choices under uncertainty, and nowhere was this more obvious than at sea. Medieval sailors faced storms, cold, hunger, disease, navigational uncertainty, and shipwreck. Ships varied by region and period. Some were remarkably capable. Sailors possessed practical knowledge of winds, currents, coastlines, and weather. But the ocean was unforgiving. A storm could overwhelm a vessel. Navigation errors could send a ship far from its intended route. Food and water could become scarce. A damaged ship could become nearly impossible to repair far from shore, and cold water was deadly. A person who fell overboard might have very little chance of survival depending on conditions. Yet sailors continued to sail. Trade depended on it. War depended on it. Fishing depended on it. Migration depended on it. The medieval economy itself depended upon movement. So again, danger was not always the result of stupidity. Sometimes people had no choice. But even sailors could be influenced by beliefs. Weather signs could become mixed with superstition. Dreams could influence decisions. Omens could be interpreted. Certain days could be considered lucky or unlucky. A sailor might avoid an action because of tradition. Another might trust an experienced navigator. And sometimes tradition probably contained practical wisdom disguised as superstition. This is an important point. Not every old belief was useless. A sailor might have learned through generations that a particular weather pattern usually preceded a storm. They might not understand atmospheric science, but their observation could be accurate. A medieval farmer might know that planting at a certain time produced better results. They might not understand soil chemistry. But generations of experience could produce reliable local knowledge, so the danger of tradition was not tradition itself. It was the assumption that tradition could never be wrong. This distinction separates wisdom from superstition. Wisdom can be tested. Superstition often resists testing. And sometimes, a practice survives because nobody wants to challenge the people who taught it. Family authority mattered. Religious authority mattered. Professional authority mattered. Political authority mattered. Social reputation mattered. If your father taught you a practice, rejecting it could seem disrespectful. If your physician recommended something, questioning it could seem foolish. If your community believed something, rejecting it could make you an outsider. Social pressure is powerful. It can make people do things they privately doubt. And this leads us to another dangerous feature of medieval society. Rumor. Rumors traveled through markets, taverns, churches, courtyards, workshops, roads, pilgrimage routes. People passed information by word of mouth. A rumor could begin with a misunderstanding. Then someone repeated it. Another person added a detail. Another person exaggerated it. Eventually, the original information might be almost unrecognizable. This was especially dangerous during crises. When disease spread, people wanted explanations. When food became scarce, people wanted someone to blame. When political conflict intensified, rumors could create panic. When strange events occurred, stories could spread faster than facts. And medieval communities had no instant fact-checking system. There was no universal news network, no scientific authority immediately available to test every claim. No digital archive where someone could search the original evidence. A rumor could therefore become reality simply because enough people believed it. This could produce terrible consequences. People might flee. They might attack others. They might accuse neighbors. They might abandon useful treatments. They might follow false medical advice. Fear could transform information into a weapon. And perhaps the most frightening thing about this is how familiar it feels. We like to imagine that misinformation is a modern problem. It is not. Modern technology simply allows misinformation to travel faster. The underlying human tendency is ancient. People repeat what they hear. People trust familiar voices. People believe information that fits their existing worldview. And people often prefer a confident explanation to an uncertain truth. The medieval world had the same psychological machinery. Only the communication technology was different. Now consider one of the most dangerous forms of medieval misinformation: the belief that certain people were responsible for disasters simply because they were outsiders. During periods of crisis, minority communities could become targets of suspicion. Accusations might arise from religious prejudice, political conflict, economic resentment, or fear. These accusations could become extraordinarily dangerous. A disease outbreak could be interpreted through existing prejudices. A rumor could transform suspicion into accusation. Accusation could become violence. And violence could become mass persecution. It is important not to reduce these events to one simple medieval superstition. The causes were complex. Political leaders could exploit fear. Economic tensions could intensify hostility. Religious differences could be manipulated. Local conflicts could become larger. But the underlying mechanism was familiar. When people are frightened, they may look for a person to blame, and blaming a visible group can feel easier than accepting uncertainty. This is one of the darkest lessons in medieval history. A false idea does not need to be scientifically complicated to kill people. It only needs to be believed by enough people. And once violence begins, the original rumor can become almost irrelevant. The consequences continue on their own. This is why the phrase "stupid trend" can sometimes be misleading. Some trends were foolish, others were simply mistaken. Others were deeply harmful because they gave ordinary people a false sense of certainty. And some were dangerous because powerful people had reasons to promote them. That is an important distinction. Not every harmful medieval practice was created by ignorant villagers. Institutions could reinforce bad ideas. Courts could enforce them. Physicians could repeat them. Authorities could benefit from them. Communities could normalize them. The entire social system could participate. And once that happens, an individual may have very little ability to resist. Imagine knowing that a common treatment seems wrong, but every respected physician recommends it. Your family trusts it. Your neighbors trust it. Your local authority trusts it. You have no laboratory, no alternative medical system, no easy way to compare outcomes. Would you refuse? For most people, probably not. This is why history should make us humble. We often imagine that if we had lived in the past, we would have recognized the mistakes immediately. But we probably would not have. We would have inherited the same assumptions. We would have grown up surrounded by the same beliefs. We would have been taught the same explanations. We would have trusted the same authorities. And we would have had the same limited information. The medieval person was not born believing medieval ideas. They learned them, just as we learn the assumptions of our own time. This is perhaps the most uncomfortable part of the story. The distance between us and medieval people is smaller than we think. They wanted safety. We want safety. They wanted health. We want health. They wanted beauty. We want beauty. They wanted status. We want status. They feared disease. We fear disease. They worried about the future. We worry about the future. They searched for explanations. We search for explanations. The difference is that we have accumulated centuries of additional knowledge. We have microscopes. We have chemistry. We have epidemiology. We have modern surgery. We have antibiotics. We have controlled trials. We have statistical methods. We have instant communication. But possessing these tools does not automatically make humans wise. We still make mistakes. We still follow trends. We still trust authority. We still confuse popularity with truth. And that is why the medieval world remains relevant. Its mistakes are not merely old mistakes. They are mirrors. As we continue, we will encounter another category of dangerous behavior, one that affected almost everyone: sleep, rest, work, and the strange ways medieval society structured the human day. Because when people work long hours, travel in darkness, wake repeatedly during the night, and live according to rhythms shaped by labor, religion, weather, and necessity, exhaustion itself can become a danger, and exhaustion can make every other danger worse. A tired person makes poorer decisions. A tired guard misses movement. A tired sailor misjudges distance. A tired laborer mishandles a tool. A tired traveler falls asleep at the wrong moment. A tired parent struggles to care for a child. The medieval world had no modern understanding of sleep science, yet people still had to live within the limits of the human body. And when society demanded more than the body could comfortably give, the consequences could be severe. So we will continue there, quietly. Because the strangest thing about these medieval dangers is that they were rarely caused by one enormous mistake. More often, they came from many small decisions: a little less sleep, a little more work, one more journey, one more risky treatment, one more rumor, one more fashion, one more unquestioned tradition. And eventually, those small decisions could add up to something irreversible. The medieval world was full of such moments. We'll follow them into the ordinary hours of everyday life, where danger was often hiding not in castles or battlefields, but in the simple decision to stay awake a little longer. And sometimes, the greatest danger was simply staying awake a little longer. The medieval day was shaped by forces that modern people rarely have to think about: sunrise, sunset, weather, seasons, religious schedules, agricultural work, animal care, travel, and the amount of daylight available for practical tasks. Artificial light existed, of course. Producing light after sunset required fuel oil. Candles cost money. Oil lamps required oil. Fire could be dangerous. So darkness naturally placed limits on activity. Yet people still worked at night. Guards remained awake. Travelers continued journeys. Craftspeople worked when necessary. Religious communities followed their own schedules. Families cared for children and animals. Sleep was therefore flexible. It was not necessarily organized around the modern idea of one uninterrupted block of 8 hours. Different people in different places had different patterns, and these patterns could change according to work, season, class, and circumstance. The danger was not that medieval people slept incorrectly. The danger was that life could repeatedly demand more from the body than the body could comfortably provide. Sleep deprivation is not dramatic. It does not always announce itself with a scream. It arrives quietly. A person becomes slower. Attention weakens. Judgment becomes less precise. Memory becomes less reliable. Reflexes become poorer. And eventually, an ordinary mistake can become a serious accident. Imagine a worker handling a sharp tool after a long day. The tool itself is not new. The task is not unusual. The danger comes from exhaustion. One moment of reduced concentration can be enough. A sailor on a dark deck faces the same problem. A guard on a wall faces it too. A rider traveling through unfamiliar terrain faces it. The medieval world could not eliminate fatigue because fatigue is part of human biology. But people did develop ways of organizing work around it. They rested when they could. They slept when circumstances allowed. They adapted, and yet necessity often overruled comfort. This is another reminder that not every dangerous medieval practice was the result of a foolish belief. Sometimes, the danger came from having no better option. A farmer could not simply decide to stop working during harvest. A traveler could not always wait for perfect weather. A soldier could not always sleep when tired. A messenger could not always delay a journey. A mother, caring for children, could not always rest. A craftsman facing a deadline might continue working. The body could protest. Life continued anyway. And that brings us to perhaps the most important theme of this entire journey. The medieval world was dangerous, but it was not uniquely foolish. It is tempting to look backward and laugh, to point at bloodletting, to point at strange medical recipes, to point at astrology, to point at extreme beauty practices, to point at superstition, to point at dangerous legal customs, and say, how could anyone possibly believe this? But that question becomes much more interesting when turned around. What do people centuries from now look at in our own age and ask the same question about? Perhaps they will wonder why we trusted certain medical ideas before fully understanding them. Perhaps they will wonder why we accepted dangerous environmental practices. Perhaps they will wonder why some products remained popular despite known risks. Perhaps they will wonder why misinformation spread so quickly despite having access to enormous amounts of information. Perhaps they will wonder why people trusted popularity more than evidence. Perhaps they will look at our fashions and wonder why we tolerated discomfort for appearance. Perhaps they will look at our working habits and wonder why people sacrificed sleep for productivity. Perhaps they will look at our obsession with status and wonder why humans repeatedly harmed themselves trying to impress strangers. The details may change. The human behavior does not. This is why the medieval world deserves more than ridicule. Its people were operating inside a system of knowledge. Some parts of that system were accurate. Some were inaccurate. Some were incomplete. Some were based on observation. Some were based on tradition. Some were based on religious belief. Some were based on philosophical reasoning. And sometimes, all of those things existed together. A medieval physician could observe a patient carefully and still hold an incorrect theory of disease. A medieval surgeon could have extraordinary practical skill and still lack knowledge of microorganisms. A medieval farmer could understand local weather patterns without understanding atmospheric science. A medieval sailor could navigate by stars without understanding celestial mechanics. A medieval midwife could possess valuable practical knowledge without knowing modern anatomy. Knowledge is rarely all or nothing. People can know one thing correctly and another thing incorrectly. That is true today. And it was true then. One of the most dangerous mistakes in history is assuming that because someone is wrong about one thing, they must be wrong about everything. Medieval knowledge does not work that way. Some medieval practices that look strange today were based on observations that were partly correct. Others were genuinely harmful. Still others changed depending on context. And some became dangerous because they were applied far beyond the situations where they might have made sense. Bloodletting is a useful example. Removing blood in certain medical contexts can be necessary. Modern medicine still removes blood under specific circumstances. The problem was not the idea that blood could ever be removed. The problem was the belief that removing blood was broadly useful for many unrelated conditions. A practice can therefore be reasonable in one situation and dangerous in another. The same is true of many historical treatments. Herbs can contain powerful chemicals. Some can be useful, some can be poisonous. The existence of herbal medicine is not proof of ignorance. But assuming that something is safe simply because it is natural is also a mistake. Medieval people sometimes knew this through experience. They understood that some plants were dangerous. They learned to distinguish useful plants from poisonous ones, but their knowledge was incomplete. Today we can isolate active compounds, measure doses, study toxicity, run controlled experiments, compare outcomes. That scientific process is one of the greatest changes between their world and ours. The difference is not simply intelligence, it is method. The ability to systematically test an idea changes what a society can know. And this is perhaps where our story ultimately leads. The problem with dangerous trends is not merely that people followed them. It is that many lacked reliable systems for challenging them. An idea could become popular without being tested properly. A treatment could become traditional without being compared against alternatives. A rumor could spread without verification. A belief could survive because no one had a practical way to disprove it. And once an idea became attached to authority, challenging it became even harder. Scientific progress therefore requires more than intelligent individuals. It requires cultures that allow questions. It requires people who can say, "I don't know." It requires people who can say, "Let's test it." It requires people who can admit, "We were wrong." Those phrases may sound simple, but they are incredibly powerful. Imagine a physician saying, "I have used this treatment for years, but I cannot prove that it works." That admission creates space for investigation. Imagine a judge saying, "We do not know who committed the crime." That admission creates space for evidence. Imagine a community saying, "We do not know why this disease is spreading." That admission creates space for observation. Uncertainty can feel frightening, but false certainty can be far more dangerous. This is one of the deepest lessons hidden inside medieval history. People often prefer an answer to no answer, even a bad answer, especially when the bad answer provides emotional comfort. A supernatural explanation can be comforting because it gives chaos a meaning. A medical theory can be comforting because it gives illness a mechanism. A rumor can be comforting because it identifies someone to blame. A fashion can be comforting because following it guarantees social acceptance. Tradition can be comforting because it removes the burden of deciding for yourself. But comfort is not the same thing as truth. And truth does not become less true because it is uncomfortable. The medieval world teaches us this again and again. There was another danger too: the desire to imitate. Humans copy one another. If a respected person wears something, others want it. If a wealthy person uses a treatment, others want it. If a famous physician recommends a remedy, people trust it. If a powerful ruler follows a custom, others may imitate it. This is how trends spread. The word trend can make something sound harmless. But trends can influence medicine, behavior, politics, and even survival. A dangerous trend does not need millions of followers. It only needs enough followers to create social pressure. Once everyone around you accepts something, refusing it becomes difficult. You may not even believe it yourself. You may simply want to belong. This was true in medieval communities, and it is true now. The medieval desire to appear wealthy provides another example. Luxury could signal status, but luxury could also create financial pressure. A person might spend beyond their means to maintain an appearance. A household might invest heavily in clothing or ceremonies. A noble might spend enormous resources maintaining a court. A merchant might try to imitate aristocratic styles. These behaviors were not necessarily deadly, but they reveal something about human nature. Status can become more important than practical needs. And once status becomes a competition, people can take enormous risks to win. This brings us back to sumptuary laws. Authorities sometimes attempted to limit luxury precisely because they understood the social consequences of status competition. If everyone competed to display wealth, social boundaries could become unstable. But attempts to regulate fashion could themselves create conflict. People resisted, authorities enforced, rules changed, and the cycle continued. The story is almost comical when viewed from a distance. People arguing over fabric, colors, sleeves, jewelry, ornaments. But underneath those details was a serious question. Who gets to look powerful? Who gets to display wealth? Who gets to belong? Appearance was never merely appearance. It was social language, and social language could become dangerous when people were willing to suffer for it. The same was true of beauty. Throughout history, people have altered their bodies to fit cultural ideals. The medieval world was no exception. But beauty standards change. What one century admires, another may find strange. This should make us cautious. Our own standards may look equally strange in the future. The human body is remarkably adaptable. People will endure pain if they believe the result is worth it. They will tolerate discomfort if it earns approval. They will follow rituals if those rituals create belonging, and they will sometimes ignore danger when everyone else appears to be doing the same thing. This is perhaps why the title of our story is slightly unfair. Completely stupid medieval trends makes it sound as though medieval people were uniquely foolish. They were not. Some practices were genuinely foolish. Some were harmful. Some were based on false assumptions. But the deeper story is about how every society creates its own blind spots. The medieval blind spots were shaped by their knowledge. Ours are shaped by ours. And future societies will have their own. So perhaps the most useful way to understand these medieval trends is not to ask, why were they so stupid? Instead, ask, what information were they missing? What assumptions were they making? What social pressures influenced their decisions? What evidence did they have? What evidence did they lack? And why did the practice survive? Those questions produce much better history. They also produce a more compassionate understanding of the past. A medieval parent who gave a traditional remedy to a sick child was not necessarily trying to be foolish. They were trying to help. A medieval physician who performed bloodletting was not necessarily trying to hurt a patient. They believed they were treating an illness. A pilgrim who crossed dangerous roads was not necessarily reckless. The journey had meaning. A warrior who accepted a dangerous challenge might have believed that honor required it. A worker who remained awake might have had no choice. A woman who followed a beauty practice might simply have wanted to fit into her society. Understanding motives does not mean excusing harm. It means understanding how harm becomes possible. And that is much more valuable, because once we understand the mechanism, we can recognize it elsewhere. We can recognize how authority works, how repetition works, how social pressure works, how fear works, how fashion works, how misinformation works, how tradition works, how certainty works, and how easily an ordinary idea can become dangerous when nobody questions it. There is another lesson hidden here. Progress is rarely sudden. The medieval world did not wake up one morning and become modern. Medical knowledge developed gradually. Surgical techniques improved. Observation became more systematic. Universities expanded. Texts circulated. Different traditions of knowledge interacted. Printing later transformed access to information. Scientific methods developed over centuries. And eventually, ideas about disease, chemistry, anatomy, and physiology changed dramatically. But progress required people to challenge inherited assumptions. That process was sometimes uncomfortable. A new idea could be ridiculed. A respected authority could be challenged. An old explanation could be abandoned. And sometimes the evidence accumulated, slowly. One observation, then another, then another. Eventually, the old explanation became harder to defend. This is how many historical changes happen, not through one brilliant moment, but through thousands of small corrections. And perhaps that is the opposite of a dangerous trend. A dangerous trend says, everyone does this. A healthy intellectual culture says, let's find out whether it works. A dangerous trend says, this has always been done. A healthy culture says, That does not prove it is right. A dangerous trend says, everyone important believes it. A healthy culture says, what is the evidence? These differences may sound small, but they can save lives. The medieval world also teaches us the importance of humility. Imagine having no antibiotics, no modern anesthesia, no blood transfusion, no modern imaging, no vaccines for many infectious diseases, no modern emergency services, no reliable laboratory testing, no modern understanding of microorganisms. A small infection could become serious. A broken bone could change a person's life. A difficult birth could become fatal. A contaminated meal could make an entire household sick. A fire could destroy a neighborhood. A storm could erase a harvest. A winter could bring hunger. Life was fragile. And because life was fragile, people developed countless strategies to protect themselves. Some worked, some partly worked, some did nothing. Some made things worse, but all of them reflected the same basic desire: to survive. That is perhaps the most important word in this entire story: survive. The medieval farmer wanted to survive the winter. The sailor wanted to survive the voyage. The soldier wanted to survive the battle. The mother wanted to survive childbirth. The physician wanted to save the patient. The traveler wanted to reach the destination. The craftsman wanted to finish the work. The child wanted to grow up. The community wanted to survive disease and famine. And sometimes survival required making decisions without enough information. That is a frightening situation, because when information is limited, every decision becomes a gamble. You make the best choice you can, and sometimes the best choice available is still a bad one. That may be the most sympathetic way to understand the people we have been discussing. They were not choosing between perfect knowledge and stupidity. They were choosing between imperfect options. And that makes their world feel surprisingly close to ours. Because we also make decisions with incomplete information. We also follow experts. We also follow trends. We also trust traditions. We also worry about appearance. We also believe things because people around us believe them. We also sometimes confuse confidence with competence. The difference is that we possess better tools for correcting mistakes. But tools only help if we use them. Information only helps if we question it. Science only helps if we accept uncomfortable results. And knowledge only protects us when we are willing to change our minds. The medieval story therefore ends not with laughter, but with reflection. The people of the past made mistakes. Some of those mistakes were astonishing. Some were painful. Some were deadly. But they were part of a long human experiment in understanding the world. Every generation inherits knowledge from the previous one. Then it adds something, corrects something, rejects something, and sometimes accidentally preserves something that should have disappeared. That process never truly ends. The world changes, the tools change, the dangers change, but the human mind remains remarkably familiar. We still want simple explanations. We still want certainty. We still want approval. We still want to belong. We still want to believe that the people we trust know what they are doing. And sometimes we still follow the crowd. That is why medieval history remains useful. It gives us distance, and distance makes patterns easier to see. We can look at an old medical treatment and immediately recognize the danger. We can look at an old superstition and recognize the lack of evidence. We can look at a dangerous fashion and wonder why anyone tolerated it. But then we can pause and ask what our own blind spots might look like from 1,000 years away. Perhaps that question is more valuable than any list of strange medieval practices. Because history is not only about judging people who lived before us, it is about learning how people behave when they are uncertain. And uncertainty is something no century has escaped. The medieval world had its dangerous trends. Some involved medicine, some involved food, some involved beauty, some involved fashion, some involved warfare, some involved religion, some involved law, some involved rumor, and some involved nothing more complicated than trusting something because everyone else trusted it. Their mistakes remind us that popularity is not proof. Tradition is not proof. Authority is not proof. Appearance is not proof. And confidence is not proof. Evidence matters. Testing matters. Questioning matters. And perhaps most importantly, admitting that we do not know matters. The people of the medieval world did not have the answers we have today, but they had curiosity. They had ingenuity. They had observation. They had practical skill. They had the ability to learn. And over generations, those qualities helped humanity move forward. The same process continues. One mistaken belief is challenged. One experiment produces a surprising result. One observation contradicts an old theory. Someone asks a question that nobody wanted to ask, and slowly, the boundaries of knowledge move. That is how dangerous ideas eventually lose their power. Not because people suddenly become smarter, but because someone becomes willing to question what everyone else accepts. So as our journey through the strangest and most dangerous medieval trends comes quietly to an end, perhaps the final thought should not be about how foolish the past was. Perhaps it should be about how human it was. The medieval physician, the medieval farmer, the medieval sailor, the medieval mother, the medieval soldier, the medieval merchant, the medieval craftsman, the medieval pilgrim. All of them were trying to understand a world that could be beautiful one moment and terrifying the next. They looked at the sky. They watched the seasons. They studied the body. They listened to stories. They trusted teachers. They followed traditions. They experimented. They failed. They learned. And sometimes they passed their mistakes to the next generation. But they also passed forward their discoveries, their engineering, their mathematics, their farming techniques, their medical observations, their craftsmanship, their architecture, their literature, their institutions, their questions. History is made from both, the things we got right and the things we got wrong. The medieval world gave us plenty of both, and perhaps tonight, when we look back at these strange practices, we can allow ourselves a small smile. Not because the people were stupid, but because humans have always been wonderfully imperfect. We try something. We believe it works. We tell our neighbors. They tell their children. The children tell their children. And one day, centuries later, someone discovers that the whole thing was based on a mistake. That is not just a medieval story. That is the story of humanity. And somewhere in the quiet remains of the medieval world, among old stones, abandoned roads, faded manuscripts, ruined workshops, and forgotten homes, there is a reminder waiting for us. Question what you inherit. Test what you can. Listen to experience, but do not confuse experience with proof. Respect tradition, but do not worship it. Trust expertise, but remember that experts can be wrong. And when you do not know the answer, allow yourself to say so. Because sometimes the most dangerous sentence in history is not, "I don't know." It is, "I know this must be true." The medieval night eventually gave way to morning. Generations changed. Old treatments disappeared. New theories appeared. Old fashions faded. New ones took their place. Some fears vanished. Others emerged. And humanity continued its long, imperfect journey toward understanding. The people we have been following are long gone now. Their voices are silent. Their streets have changed. Their homes have disappeared. But their mistakes remain, not as reasons to mock them, as warnings, as questions, as reminders. And perhaps, if we listen quietly enough, they tell us something simple. Being human has always meant making decisions with incomplete knowledge. The goal is not to become a person who never makes mistakes. The goal is to become a person and a society capable of recognizing them. That is the lesson the medieval world leaves behind. And with that, our journey comes to an end. The candles burn lower. The old streets grow quiet. The voices fade into the distance, and the centuries settle gently back into silence. The medieval world is gone, but the questions it leaves us are still here. What do we believe? Why do we believe it? And how willing are we to change our minds when the evidence tells us that we were wrong? Perhaps that is the safest trend of all. Curiosity, questioning, learning, and the quiet courage to say, maybe there is another explanation. Good night.